War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 58, the North African Campaign of World War II. The previously discussed Torch invasion was the highlight for the North African Campaign and spelled the soon-to-be end of the German/Italian efforts there. Prior to Torch, it was a battle of incompetence at various levels. The Italians were finally made Florenz clown shoes, attempting to encroach on the British in Egypt from their Libyan colony. The Italians held off on formally aligning with Nazi Germany until the Germans had successfully conquered France. The Italian colony was the result of the little-known Turco-Italian War from 1911 to 1912, when the Italians conquered the Ottoman territories of Fezzan, Cyrenaica, and Tripolitania. This conflict exposed the weakness of the Ottoman Empire and emboldened the Balkan states to revolt, which led directly to World War I. Ironically, the Italians and Ottomans would be allied only 2 years later with World War I, and in fact were quasi-allies at the time. The war was the result of a public demand that the Italians join the other great European powers in developing North African colonies, like France and Spain and Britain. Ironically, Mussolini at the time was still a left-wing anti-colonialist socialist and was vocally against the war. The Ottomans were squashing a revolt in North Yemen and had left their North African colonies with a scant police presence, and a mere 20,000 Italian troops with colonial auxiliaries were sufficient to gain their victory. The bulk of the fighting was by troops from Mogadishu, which was the capital of Italian Somaliland. In a first, only 8 years after the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, the Italians used heavier-than-air aircraft to perform reconnaissance flights and dropped hand grenades, a first for tactical air bombardment. The war itself was notable also for the initial victories on the coastal cities, but the Ottomans simply retreated into the nearly endless southern desert, which consumed more and more garrison troops, which eventually numbered more than 100,000. Winning a colony is easy, holding one is far more difficult. Even after the 1912 surrender by the Ottomans, local Muslims of the Sunnisi order continued to revolt with a 10-year counterinsurgency campaign focused, predictably, in the mountains, in the Jebel Akhdar region. As an etymological side note, the name Libya dates to the ancient Egyptians who used it to describe the tribes around Syrencia and Marmarica. The name was historical footnote until an Italian archaeologist resurrected it, and the Italians adopted the name to de-emphasize its Muslim and Ottoman nature, which for centuries was known as Tripolitania, yet another colonialist name given to an artificially drawn random border that is both decried and defended by the anti-colonialist forces that now benefit from it. In 1940, the Italians had over 100,000 troops in Libya, divided between guarding the eastern border with British Egypt and the western border with French North Africa. But with the French surrender and conversion to the fascist cause, this freed up Mussolini to mass his troops on the Egyptian border. He then quickly joined Hitler's Axis. Up until then, Italy was neutral. His plan, and it made sense, was to invade Egypt when Hitler landed in England in the ultimately cancelled Sea Line invasion. Upon the declaration of war, the British captured Fort Capuzzo on the coastal road right on the Libyan side of the border, before the Italian redeployment was complete. 3 months later, the Italians counterattacked, having realized the invasion of Great Britain would never materialize. This massive force had initial success, but, like all things with the North African campaign, was limited by operational considerations. The vast desert, which provided ample maneuver at the tactical level, was for all intents and purposes impassable to the logistical trains required to sustain combat operations. Instead, limited to the lone coastal road, itself not much more than a trail. North Africa is a region. In it was contained not countries in the modern sense, but simply city-states ruled by tribes, and considered contiguous only by the European countries who had but loose control. So the Italian counteroffensive culminated after about 100 miles, seizing nothing of note. Despite the vast numbers of 100,000, this is a little bit of a misnomer in that they were all pretty much light infantry with very little mechanization, as they were occupation forces, not really frontline combat forces. The British were able to counterattack with 36,000 men, the 3-to-1 advantage given to the nominal defenders. But with the bulk of the Italian forces being comprised of the less than motivated and trained colonial levies, and again, as noted, with little motorized transport, this was more than enough. The British, over the next 2 months, seized all of the lost Egyptian territory and made it to Tobruk, a main supply port on the Libyan coast, where they captured 40,000 Italian troops, who were awaiting evacuation back to Italy. This British attack, led by General Archibald Wavell and called Operation Compass, was a massive success, eventually capturing over 100,000 Italian troops and led Mussolini to beg his newfound ally, Hitler, for help. Hitler committed the famous Afrika Korps, led by a hero of World War I and successful division commander during the Poland and French campaigns, Erwin Rommel. Despite being an infantryman by trade, he proved particularly adept at armored tactics. The Italians likewise committed additional forces and retained the bulk of the Axis combat power. Tripoli, being on the western side of Libya and close to Italy, provided the base for the newly strengthened Axis forces. Hitler's intent for North Africa was to tie down as many British forces as possible and delay a second front in Europe long enough to defeat Stalin and the Soviet Union. Rommel, however, was not disposed to such a strategy and turned a basic armed reconnaissance into an all-out attack, pushing British forces back to Egypt and surrounding the Australian 9th Infantry Division at Tobruk. Bypassing the Commonwealth troops trapped at Tobruk, Rommel continued east, eventually crossing into Egypt, before culminating at Sollum and the critical Halfaya Pass, which provided effectively the only supply route from Egypt to Libya and vice versa. It was here the Germans dug in to await the predicted counterattack. Rommel's advance was not stopped by any combat prowess by the British, but rather his extended supply lines and poor logistical support. 3 separate times the British tried to break through, with the first 2 being wasteful defeats. Finally, during Operation Crusader, 6 months later, the British maneuvered around and were able to relieve the siege at Tobruk. This required a full Second Corps of armored forces, building up the now British 8th Army, comprised of Commonwealth troops and a brigade of Free French. Having relieved Tobruk, the British continued to push west where the British culminated, and Rommel obliged the hasty defenses with yet another counterattack, defeating the British at the Battle of Gazala 6 months later, in the heat of June, and recapturing Tobruk. And Rommel, being Rommel, continued to push eastward despite lacking the orders or logistics to do so. Of note, the Germans had broken the British code, which had given them full knowledge of the British tactical positions, strengths, and plans. The German advance culminated, again, this time at El Alamein, where the British established a defensive position inside Egypt. El Alamein was critical because it was a narrow choke point between the Qattara Depression and the Mediterranean Sea. The sandy wastelands of the depression were impassable to any but tracked vehicles, rendering all advances near impossible. The combined German and Italian forces tried to sneak through, attacking the desert just to the north of the depression and south of El Alamein to break through. The attempt was repulsed, and this returns to the bias of action. Even had the Germans succeeded, then what? Push on to Alexandria and seize the Suez Canal? This was impossible, logistically, operationally, and strategically. The British were now on their 5th commander. Archie Wavell had been replaced by Claude Auchinleck, following the initial failures to relieve Tobruk. This latest defeat saw Alexander replace Auchinleck, and then God, who was picked but died when his plane was shot down, and Bernard Montgomery finally given his command of the 8th Army. Montgomery, for all his questionable tactics, did at least learn the lessons from the past few years of fighting, namely, that the campaigns in North Africa are dictated by logistics alone, and to embark on an attack without maintaining the required logistics to sustain the profitable pursuit was a waste of time. So he waited until he had enough logistics to break through the Germans during the Second Battle of El Alamein in late October, and beginning a slow, deliberate, but unchecked advance through Libya en route to the strategic center of gravity for the Axis forces in North Africa, Tripoli and its critical port. Only weeks later, the previously discussed torch landings opened up a second front in North Africa in the western French territories, which really spelled the beginning of the end of the Italian attempts at grandiose colonization of North Africa. The Second Battle of El Alamein was chaos. Rommel was actually in Europe at the time, and command had been delegated to Stumme, who had a heart attack in the middle of the battle. Montgomery's plan was to advance on 2 fronts, with infantry leading the tanks to clear a hole through the German minefields, which was ridiculously optimistic, assuming a 16-mile advance on day 1 through 5-mile deep minefields. This would be a common thread of Montgomery to promise rapid, audacious advances that never materialized. Montgomery's patience gave him 230,000 men for the attack, while Rommel had 80,000 total and only 27,000 Germans. Additionally, Montgomery was armed with 1,400 relatively modern tanks to 260 for the Germans and another 200 outclassed and out-of-date Italian tanks. In the air, the ratio was much the same. Additionally, the Royal Navy was highly successful in strangling the sea lines of communication, or S-locks, into Tobruk and Tripoli. Artillery ammunition and fuel was especially lacking. Rommel couldn't have supported more tanks even if he had them. And it's a good thing. Montgomery troops again and again were trapped in German minefields and taking horrific losses, 5-1 losses in tanks alone. But it was enough. Rommel was preparing to retreat when Hitler ordered him to stand fast at El Alamein. Rommel retreated anyway, and Montgomery, in what would become a habitual failure, froze and declined the pursuit. Several times from the battle until the ultimate fall of Tunisia and Tripoli, Montgomery would mass forces to break through German and Italian defenses, suffer horrific losses, and then decline to pursue, so he would repeat the process again. He would do similar in France after D-Day as the commander of ground forces in Europe. Realizing the threat of the French switching sides again, the Germans and Italians flooded into Tunisia, hoping to stop the Allied advance coming from the west. The Americans thought a quick attack might beat this buildup, forcing a single division into Tunisia, which proved far too inadequate. At this, the Germans thought they had discovered an opportunity to inflict an actual defeat on the inexperienced Americans and flooded Tunis with top-of-the-line troops and equipment, including the new Tiger tanks sporting 88mm guns. As the Germans and Italians were compressed in Tunisia, and with the S-lock still open to Italy, they were capable of mounting a large counterattack, which was probably Rommel's greatest tactical achievement, but operational and strategic failure. He attacked at several points to the Americans to his west, feinting and successfully masking his main effort. But the massive American and British armor proved too much. Despite the German victory at the critical Kasserine Pass, his forces couldn't hold the objective of the crossroads at Thala, and a counterattack by the Allies, supported by a massive reserve, forced Rommel to retreat, and a half-hearted and understrength attack against Montgomery's yet again paused forces ended in defeat. Rommel was recalled home, and the Americans and British slowly advanced against a now abandoned Axis force. By April, the compressed Germans had only one front, defending the critical port of Tunis, which fell on 8 May. The Allies, despite operating less than 100 miles from Sicily, had complete sea control, thus nullifying any hope of evacuation of the besieged Axis forces, and 250,000 surrendered on 13 May. Rommel, for all his tactical brilliance, failed in utterly understanding his mission and requirements. He was a poor choice for overall command because his personality, so magnetic and motivational, was inspired only through offensive action. He was incapable of conducting the economy of forced delay that Hitler needed to maximize efforts on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Rommel complained incessantly about the poor logistics of his forces, knowing his complaints wouldn't change the situation. He would have been far better to acknowledge the limitations and marshal them intelligently in a deliberate defense in depth. Instead, he squandered them against superior forces in tactically inspired battles that inevitably culminated before a decisive defeat could be inflicted on the Allies. Only Montgomery's inability to execute a successful pursuit let the campaign go on as long as it did. The North African campaign was a study in the culmination of battle inherent in a limited logistics environment when conducting mechanized operations. The logistical limitations were twofold. One was the necessity of traveling by sea, always Germany's weakness. The Germans weren't made for expeditionary warfare, always being a continental-based power. The failure of sea line to materialize should have been the signal to abandon the Italians and their colony. Would the resources dedicated to North Africa been enough to sway the Eastern Front had Germany focused their mass on that primary objective? Probably not. But the economy of force in North Africa ended up not being so economical. Altogether, the Germans and Italians lost nearly 500,000 men. On the Allied side, Montgomery's insistence on overwhelming combat power was the correct operational concept, but tactically, his failure to capitalize on his hard-fought set-piece victories with an audacious pursuit should have been the culmination of his career, not a launching pad for greater roles. As noted earlier, Torch was a nearly perfect operation, but the delay caused by the 1,500-mile separation of landing sites meant the landing could not take advantage of this initial advantageous operation. Ultimately, operations must always be planned with the strategic end state in mind. Rommel's job was to survive as long as possible. He failed. The Allies' job was to seize Tunis and Tripoli, not merely to defeat Rommel. The plans focused on the latter and often wasted the opportunity to do the former. And with that, I hope to start a series of analysis of famous battles, focusing on center of gravity analysis, context within the war, psychology of the commanders, and the principles of war, interrupted as required by requests from listeners and any current events. We will start with the 15 Decisive Battles of the World by Sir Edward Shepherd Creasy in 1851. First up, the Battle of Marathon, next week. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.